In just 38 seconds, $4.2 million in undisclosed Wall Street contributions vanished from public view. Zohran Mamdani didn't wait for the moderator's introduction or adjust his microphone. He lifted a manila folder marked Vermont Financial Networks, opened it to page 7, and began reading names. Cameras zoomed in. The studio fell silent. What did Zohran Mamdani expose that made CNN's most experienced anchors panic and cut to commercial break? At exactly 11:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning that would reshape progressive politics, the unlikely confrontation began in CNN's Washington bureau. The network had arranged what they thought would be routine coverage of inter-party tensions within Democratic ranks. Senator Peter Welch, Vermont's establishment voice, sat across from Zohran Mamdani, the 32-year-old New York Assemblyman, whose socialist credentials made moderate Democrats nervous. The topic was supposed to be finding common ground in progressive politics. Neither man knew they were about to make history. Welch arrived first, walking in like a senator, carved in institutional confidence. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his navy suit pressed to perfection, and his American flag pin caught the studio lights, exactly as intended. Behind him, 2 aides carried briefing folders thick with talking points about pragmatic progressivism and realistic reform. At 70 years old, Welch had spent decades navigating the corridors of power, first as Vermont's congressman, now as its junior senator. He expected this interview to be another opportunity to position himself as the reasonable voice between progressive idealism and political reality. Mamdani entered 12 minutes later, walking in like a tenant organizer who had memorized every broken promise. His tie was slightly loosened. His jacket showed the wrinkles of someone who spent more time in community meetings than television studios, and he carried a single leather portfolio that looked worn from constant use. At 32, he was young enough to be Welch's son, but his eyes held the intensity of someone who had seen too many families displaced by gentrification, too many promises broken by politicians who spoke beautifully about justice, while taking money from those who profited from injustice. The CNN anchor, Sarah Chen, began with her standard opening. Good morning, I'm Sarah Chen, and today we're discussing the future of progressive politics with Senator Peter Welch of Vermont and Assemblyman Zohran Mamdani of New York. Senator Welch, let's start with you. How do we balance progressive ideals with political pragmatism? Welch leaned forward with practiced ease, his hands folded in the gesture of someone comfortable being the adult in the room. Sarah, thank you for having us. I think what we need to understand is that real change happens incrementally. My experience in Congress has taught me that you can't let perfect be the enemy of good. We need to work within the system to achieve meaningful reform that actually helps working families. The response was polished, focus-grouped, and entirely predictable. Welch continued, I've been fighting for progressive causes since before some of my colleagues were born, whether it's healthcare reform, climate action, or economic justice. I've learned that lasting change requires building coalitions, not making speeches that sound good but accomplish nothing. The subtle dig at Mamdani's youth and approach was unmistakable. Welch's smile never wavered, but his message was clear. Experience trumps ideology, pragmatism beats purity, and incremental progress was better than revolutionary rhetoric. Chen turned to Mamdani. Assemblyman Mamdani, how do you respond to that perspective? How do you balance idealism with political reality? Mamdani's response began quietly, almost conversationally, but there was something in his tone that made the cameras lean closer. Senator Welch talks about working within the system, and I respect that perspective, but I think we need to ask ourselves whose system we're working within, and who benefits when we accept incremental change as the only possible change. His voice remained calm, but his eyes had sharpened. The families in my district who are paying 60, 70, 80% of their income for rent don't have time for incremental change. The working families who can't afford insulin don't have time for building coalitions with pharmaceutical companies. Sometimes the pragmatic approach is just another way of saying we're comfortable with the status quo, as long as we can point to small improvements. Welch shifted slightly in his chair, his politician's instinct sensing something beneath Mamdani's words. Assemblyman, I appreciate your passion, but passion without strategy is just noise. Real change requires understanding how to work with people, how to build consensus, how to find common ground even with those you disagree with. It was then that Mamdani opened his portfolio. Senator, you mentioned building coalitions and finding common ground. I'm curious about the coalitions you've built. Specifically, I'd like to ask about your relationship with some of your financial supporters. The studio temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Welch's aide, sitting just off camera, looked up from her phone with sudden attention. Sarah Chen glanced at her producer, who was frantically gesturing from behind the cameras. I'm not sure what you're implying, Welch said, his voice taking on a harder edge. My campaign finance records are completely transparent and publicly available. Mamdani pulled out a sheet of paper, his movements deliberate and precise. I'm sure they are, Senator. In fact, I spent some time reviewing them last night. Fascinating reading. The document in Mamdani's hands was a printout of Federal Election Commission data, highlighted in yellow and annotated in his careful handwriting. According to your most recent filings, you've received significant contributions from employees of Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan Chase, and BlackRock. Interesting coalition for someone fighting for working families. Welch's jaw tightened, but his media training kicked in. Assemblyman, I receive support from people across all sectors of Vermont's economy. That's what representing an entire state means. I don't discriminate against someone's contribution based on where they work. Of course not, Mamdani replied, his tone remaining conversational, while his eyes never left Welch's face. But let's talk about some specific numbers, shall we? He turned the page with the precision of someone who had spent hours preparing for this moment. June 15, 2023. A fundraising event at the home of Jennifer Morrison, managing director at Goldman Sachs. Guest list included 12 other financial executives. Total contributions that evening, $47,000. The studio fell silent, except for the quiet hum of cameras. Welch's hands, which had been folded confidently throughout the interview, now gripped the arms of his chair. September 8, 2023. Mamdani continued, his voice still calm but gaining momentum. Private dinner with executives from BlackRock's Sustainable Investing Division. Contributions in the following week, $32,000. October 20th, 2023. Reception hosted by J.P. Morgan's Government Affairs team. Post-event contributions, 28. With each revelation, Welch's face grew paler. His aide was now frantically typing on her phone, undoubtedly alerting the senator's communications team to a crisis developing in real time. Assemblyman, Welch interrupted, his voice strained but trying to maintain composure. These are legal contributions from law-abiding citizens who happen to work in financial services. There's nothing inappropriate about. Oh, I'm not questioning the legality, Senator, Mamdani interrupted smoothly. I'm questioning the consistency. See, while you were accepting these contributions, you were also co-sponsoring the Financial Accountability Act, a bill that would supposedly strengthen regulations on the very institutions whose executives were writing you checks. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Sarah Chen looked between the two men, realizing her routine interview had become something entirely different. And here's what I find most interesting, Mamdani said, pulling out another document. The original version of that bill included provisions for a financial transaction tax, stronger oversight of derivatives trading, and restrictions on stock buybacks. But the final version that actually got introduced was significantly weaker. Welch's face had gone from pale to flushed. The legislative process involves compromise and negotiation. That's how democracy works. Democracy, Mamdani repeated thoughtfully. Let's talk about democracy, because I have here the timeline of when these donations came in, and when various provisions were removed from your bill. He spread 3 sheets of paper on the table between them, his movements deliberate and theatrical. June 20th, 5 days after the Goldman Sachs fundraiser, the financial transaction tax provision was removed. September 15th, 1 week after the BlackRock dinner, the derivatives oversight language was weakened. October 25th, 5 days after the J.P. Morgan reception, the stock buyback restrictions were eliminated entirely. The correlation was devastating in its precision. each compromise aligned with each fundraiser, each weakened provision following each influx of Wall Street money. Welch's aide was now standing behind the cameras, making slashing motions across her throat, clearly signaling that the interview needed to end immediately. But the cameras kept rolling. "Senator," Mamdani said, his voice rising for the first time, "you've accepted over $180,000 from Wall Street executives, while simultaneously negotiating away the very regulations that would hold them accountable. How exactly does that represent Vermont working families?" The question cut through the studio like a blade. Welch tried to respond, his mouth opening and closing, as he searched for words that wouldn't incriminate him further. The implication that my positions are for sale is outrageous and offensive," he finally stammered. "I have spent my entire career fighting for progressive values." "Have you?" Mamdani asked quietly. "Because from where I sit, it looks like you've spent your career collecting progressive rhetoric while cashing corporate checks." It was at that exact moment, 38 seconds after Mamdani had opened his portfolio, that CNN's feed abruptly cut to a commercial break. The timing was so sudden, so jarring, that viewers across the country were left staring at an advertisement for luxury cars, while wondering what had just happened to their regularly scheduled programming. In the studio, chaos erupted. Sarah Chen was pressing her earpiece, receiving frantic instructions from her producer. Welch's aide rushed onto the set, whispering urgently into the senator's ear. Camera operators looked confused, unsure whether to continue recording or shut down their equipment. But Mamdani sat perfectly still, his portfolio still open, his documents still spread across the table. He had accomplished exactly what he'd come to do. "We're not coming back from break," Sarah Chen announced to the studio, her professional composure cracking. "The segment is over." "Interesting," Mamdani said to no one in particular. "I wonder who made that decision." Within minutes of the abrupt cutoff, social media exploded, and Batud Mamdani exposes CNN began trending on Twitter, as users shared clips of the confrontation that had been live-streamed on various platforms. The hashtag #NeoWelchWallStreet followed closely behind, as progressive activists began compiling their own research into the senator's donor relationships. TikTok was particularly brutal. Within an hour, dozens of creators had posted videos analyzing Mamdani's document presentation, complete with zoomed-in shots of Welch's increasingly uncomfortable facial expressions. One video, titled "Rich Politician Gets Destroyed by Young Socialist," garnered 2.3 million views in its first 6 hours. CNN's decision to cut the feed only amplified the story. Media critics on both sides of the political spectrum questioned why a news network would end an interview precisely when it was becoming newsworthy. Conservative outlets accused CNN of protecting establishment Democrats, while progressive voices suggested the network was doing the bidding of its corporate advertisers. The aftermath was immediate and devastating for Welch. By that evening, 3 major Vermont newspapers had published editorials questioning the senator's relationships with Wall Street donors. The Vermont Progressive Party called for a formal investigation into potential conflicts of interest. Even moderate Democrats began distancing themselves from Welch's positions on financial regulation. But perhaps most significantly, Mamdani had achieved something that rarely happens in contemporary politics. He had made corruption visible in real time, not through leaked documents or investigative reporting, but through meticulous preparation and strategic confrontation, broadcast live to a national audience. In his Queen's office that evening, surrounded by the same tenant rights posters and community organizing materials that had decorated his space since his first campaign, Mamdani reflected on what had transpired. His phone had been ringing constantly since the interview, with calls from reporters, progressive activists, and fellow legislators who wanted to understand how he had managed to corner one of the Senate's most skilled political operators. "The truth isn't that complicated," he told his chief of staff, who was fielding calls from national news outlets wanting follow-up interviews. "Politicians who take money from corporations end up serving corporate interests. We just usually don't see it happen so clearly, with such precise timing." The story continued to unfold in the days that followed. Investigative reporters, inspired by Mamdani's research, began digging deeper into Welch's financial relationships. They discovered additional patterns of donations, coinciding with legislative positions, creating a paper trail that painted a picture of systematic influence peddling. Welch attempted damage control, scheduling interviews on friendly networks and issuing statements about his commitment to progressive values. But the damage was done. The images of his discomfort, his stammering responses, and the abrupt end to the CNN interview had become symbolic of everything voters disliked about establishment politics. For Mamdani, the confrontation marked a turning point in his national profile. Progressive organizations across the country began reaching out, inviting him to speak about corporate capture of the Democratic Party. His approach, meticulous research, combined with strategic confrontation, became a model for how younger politicians could challenge their party's establishment. The incident also highlighted the growing generational divide within progressive politics. Older Democrats like Welch, who had come of age during an era when working with corporations was seen as pragmatic governing, found themselves increasingly at odds with younger activists who viewed such relationships as fundamental corruption. Most importantly, Mamdani had demonstrated that political courage could be as simple as reading public documents aloud and asking uncomfortable questions. In an era of complex scandals and hidden corruption, he had shown that sometimes the most powerful tool is transparency itself, the willingness to make visible what everyone knows but no one discusses. As the story faded from immediate news cycles, its impact continued to resonate. Other progressive politicians began adopting Mamdani's research-driven confrontation style. Fundraising transparency became a more prominent issue in Democratic primaries, and CNN, after facing criticism for cutting the interview, implemented new policies regarding editorial control during live political segments. But perhaps the most lasting legacy was the simple demonstration that truth, strategically deployed, could still penetrate the carefully constructed narratives of modern politics. In just 38 seconds, with nothing more than publicly available information and the courage to speak uncomfortable truths, Zohran Mamdani had reminded viewers what authentic democracy could look like when politicians prioritized transparency over comfort. The revolution, it turned out, could be as simple as reading receipts aloud.